Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Steve Salisbury. Steve is the president of Steve Salisbury Consulting. He is passionate about working with executives to successfully transform their business. Steve has worked with some of the world's most recognizable companies to set the change in motion by creating transformational capacity, galvanizing leaders, and driving accountability to institutionalize the entire transformation within the organization. Steve is also an accomplished speaker. He effortlessly weaves in lessons from his rich and diverse history, including agriculture, winemaking, and we are certainly going to talk about winemaking, lay ministry, and association leadership. Steve spent most of his adult life in southwestern Michigan and now lives with his wife in Chicago. His hobbies include Chicago history, architecture, and family history, and he still owns the southwestern Michigan family vineyard his parents purchased in the 1960s. Steve, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Well, thank you, Howard. It's great to be with you today.
Really excited to be able to have you join me on the podcast. You and I have been probably friends more so virtually via our connection on LinkedIn. And it was really a pleasure a couple of weeks back before the holidays to participate in a focus group session with you. And I remember we were having this conversation. How did we meet? And it's more than just the LinkedIn connection. And I'm sure we're going to get to that. And like, how did we meet? But I would love if you could share a little bit about your work. Give us the kind of the high level points of what you're doing and what does transformation mean? Because that's a word that it's a very common word within the organization development, coaching space. So I'm sure it means something very dear to your heart.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a great question to start with. I actually had one of my executive clients say to me, Steve, you talk about this transformational stuff, and that's a great word. But when we think about what you've done for us in our organization, transformation doesn't really do it justice. It seems like you need a bucket to put all of this work in. And that's the one that makes sense. I think the more layman's way to think about what I do is closing the gap between strategy and execution. What I've learned in doing this work for years is that there are different skills required for executives to develop strategy versus execute strategy. And there's a space or a gap in between, if you will, where they transition from strategy to execution. And that's where I see most change, whether it's transformational or not, where most change struggles. Right? Leaders aren't quite sure what to do, what their role is, how do they need to show up in the work. There may be team alignment issues. So the leadership team, when they're building the strategy, say, oh yeah, this is great. But when it comes down to actually executing, the disagreements start and they start saying, well, I didn't expect that to happen in my organization and we can't do that. And all of a sudden you get this sort of cross-functional dysfunction amongst the leadership team. And then I think finally, it's how do we enroll the employees to actually take it, own it, execute it, because when it's all said and done, they're the ones, the frontline employees, who are going to be left holding the bag, as it were. They're going to be the ones left to actually keep it running day to day. They're the ones that have to sustain it. So involve them as early as you can to help figure out how to execute whatever it is you're trying to execute in terms of your strategy.
As you've just kind of laid out this idea of transformation strategy versus execution and the leader realizing, kind of like Marshall Goldsmith book, what got him there or her there is not enough.
Absolutely.
And it's not, they need something different now. And so I'm curious who your ideal client is. I mean, in our introduction, we talked about you working with some very recognizable companies. And just given the nature of your work, I mean, you've literally worked all over the world. I would imagine those are very recognizable logos. So I'm curious, when we talk about the work you're doing today, is it still these big companies that are still struggling between strategy and execution, and the leaders and the teams not aligned with that? Or are you working with more entrepreneurial startup organizations where what it takes to be an entrepreneur and starting a business and literally doing everything, growing it and realizing I can't do it all, I'm running out of time, I can't get things done, I need help. And then they start to go, and they don't want to crash and burn, but they want this organization to grow well organically. Where's your sweet spot within this ideal client base?
That's another great question. I would have to say the short answer is it's probably more the former. In fact, just yesterday, I met with two large corporate clients, the companies you've heard of. They're both household names. And one case, they're going through a large technology change that's going to impact lots of people across the organization. There's concerns about people being able to adapt to the process and behavioral changes that are going to be required as a result. And the other company is just hired a new senior leader, and she's building out her leadership team and wants to make sure that the team is aligned and focused and moving forward in a successful way.
Very interesting. And how do they find you? Is it through word of mouth? Is it Googling organizational change development on the internet? Is it referral? And then when they do find you, what are they saying? Because sometimes I've learned what you are told what the problem is, or it's shared with you what the problem is, or what needs to be solved. Sometimes it's not what you're asking is really not what needs to be done. There's something else going on here that you should address. So what are they saying to you, Steve, like Steve Salisbury? We need your help. And how does that kind of play out for you?
Another interesting question. I would say, to answer the first part of your question, most of the work that I do comes from former clients. That's who I spoke with yesterday, two former clients. In one case, it was a client who worked for a previous firm who moved over to a new firm, but a previous client. I do receive some work via referral. To be completely candid, nobody's ever picked up the phone blindly and called me and said, "Hey, we think we could use your help." Right? I think those are few and far between. But I think the more interesting part of your question is, what do they say? I remember one. So this was a referral client a couple of years ago who was referred to me. And our first meeting was a sort of a get-to-know-you conversation. He started to describe what his organization was going through and some of his growth goals, right? And he just didn't feel like he or his leadership team were ready to embrace the kind of growth that they saw themselves needing over the planning horizon, and felt like they needed some help sorting that out from a cultural perspective.
What is the typical, and I that's probably not a really good word, because in your line of work, my line of work, there is no such thing as typical, but organizational change, embracing, for example, new technology. And in my days as a recovering IT business consultant, because that's what I tell people, that's what I am, I remember the deployments of document management systems, ERP systems, healthcare claims processing systems, and none of them ever went smoothly. None of them. What was sold and marketed and how things actually played out, it was a death march. And I'd always also heard, when it comes to mergers and acquisition, there is a lot of culture and organizational change and churn going on there. And I've always heard most of those fail, those mergers and acquisitions, because some of the planning, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, blocking and tackling, whatever metaphor you want to use, just wasn't happening. People thought, well, we're just going to buy this company and all of a sudden they're going to be a part of us and that's it. What's the biggest struggle that from these large tech changes or hiring that you're seeing? Are companies just not learning about the change or how to do it, that they need folks like you to come in? Or why is it? I mean, it's great that we're busy. Okay. Well, we hope that we're busy.
Yes. Right.
And they need us because we can help them solve their problem. But why are these problems still occurring? It's almost as though this change is going to occur, this transformation is going to occur, and now we've got to do the same thing again, what we did on a previous project.
Well, there's probably as many reasons, or many answers to your questions as there are people on the planet, right? But a couple of things tend to percolate to the top. From my perspective, what I tend to see is that they don't do this purposely, but executives kind of get into this cocoon, right? I'm leading my company and everything's great. And we're going to do this little change, whatever it is. And all of a sudden they start struggling, right? And it's the same struggle that a company 3 doors down Main Street might have gone through 5 years ago, but they don't really think about sharing those kinds of things. So we end up having work as a result. But I also think it comes down to, it's something we sort of alluded to early on in the author's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. I think.
Get You There, Marshall Goldsmith. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I met him once.
I had 2 bottles of champagne with him once.
Oh, really?
And he actually paid the bill too. So like, little did I know, I mean, champagne, am I going to be on the hook for this? But he paid for it, but that was fun. So we can both say we've met Marshall Goldsmith.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I think there's a really valid point just in the title of the book. Most executives, most managers are promoted to executive roles because they're very good at managing the work in their function. But when you move into an executive role, that job, if you will, that job content really changes significantly. And now you're no longer responsible for managing the content of the execution of a particular function. Now you're responsible to knit things together. And so your role becomes more of a coach, as a leader and coach, to make sure that the different parts of the organization are coming together successfully to deliver the goods. So if I were to boil down all of my experiences into one sort of underlying symptom, that's it. One of the first projects I did after I left corporate America was for an organization on the West Coast, and the executive sponsor was basically the second in command of the organization. You know, when I first met him, he didn't have a lot of nice things to say for other functions in the organization. After some coaching and counseling and a couple of nice lunches out, sort of convinced him that language and the underlying mindset wasn't going to help him be successful with this project.
Most definitely about that. This brings up an interesting question then. Given your experience and the type of work that you're doing, are there some favorite aspects? I mean, so we all have to do things. Oh, I don't want to have to write this report. Oh, I've got 5 days in a row of interviews or the travel, whatever it is, because we have to be where our clients are for the most part. Sometimes we get to do it virtually. But in your work, Steve, what are the pieces that, man, I love doing this. This is why I do what I do?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And for me, it boils down to whatever makes the light bulb come on. And so that's a bit esoteric. Let me describe that a bit. And where that usually happens is in one of 2 places. When I'm doing one-on-one coaching with an executive, or when I'm leading some sort of a facilitated workshop for that executive and his leadership team. You always see that sort of pivot point. And when it's like, like a workshop, they all, have it on their calendars, they show up for the meeting, and you just know, you can feel it. Oh my gosh, we're going to spend a whole day together and I've got so much to do and I don't want to be here. And yet a third or halfway through the meeting, not even that long, they're completely engaged. And by the time you get to the end, they're like, holy cow, this was a great experience. I feel energized and activated, and I'm really ready to like change the world. When you see that sort of thing happen and the light bulb goes on, that to me just is so satisfying. And that can happen in a workshop or even in a coaching session, right?
When you are doing the workshop or with the individual client and they've gone through some initial coaching, there's the light bulbs are going off, going pop, pop, pop. And they say to you, Steve, this was fantastic. I love it. This was great. I can't wait to go back to wherever I came from and put this into play. As a coach, consultant, advisor, mentor, how are you working with your clients to ensure it sticks?
I anticipated that's where you were going with this question. Because because at the end of the day, Howard, it's all about sustainability, right? You can have a great coaching session, you can do a fantastic workshop, but if it's not sustainable, then it ain't going to work. So in the workshop, we'll take that as an example. In the various workshops that I do, one of the things that we end up with toward the end of the meeting is a plan. It's not a hugely detailed plan, but it's an outline of things that we agree to as a group that need to be done in order to affect whatever it is we're trying to change, whether it's culture or whatever. And depending on what level of engagement they've contracted me for, I may actually help them with that implementation. That's sort of at one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is I will check up on them 60, 90, 180 days out and ask them, how's it going? Were you having trouble spots? So it isn't just love them and leave them. There's some follow-up on my part to make sure that they're executing what it is we agreed to. The same happens with coaching. It's just a different scale.
Okay. You've been in this business quite a while, and here we are, 2020. The big thing on New Year's Eve is Barbara Walters going to be up on TV going, this is Barbara Walters, and you're listening to 2020. So, and I'm thinking, 2020 hindsight is, as I say, is 2020. But what's the future hold in this decade? Anything kind of jump out for you? Are we getting better? Are we still struggling, or are things going to happen that we need to prepare for?
I just wrote about this in my blog, so you've done your homework.
Yeah, that's a part of the requirement for doing these podcasts is I have to do a little bit of homework.
No, that's great. From my perspective in the work that I do, I see three things happening. I see change, transformation, innovation just happening faster and faster all the time, to the point where I call it continuous transformation, right? We're continually looking at everything that we're doing to figure out if we can make it better. Now, there has to be some management around that, but that's for another day. My second prediction is that this gap I talked about earlier between strategy and execution, executives are going to get smarter and smarter about how to close that gap. That might put me out of business, but I think I don't have to worry about that. But I think it is going to close. I do believe that's going to close. My last prediction is a really hot topic these days. There's this thing that I've labeled the integrity deficit syndrome. I think we're suffering, not just in America, but across the globe. And I'll limit my comments to business, but it certainly could apply in any area of our lives. You read about it in the newspaper almost every day. McDonald's, Boeing, CBS, you name them, Harvey Weinstein. All these organizations are having integrity issues. And my prediction is that it's actually probably going to get a little bit worse, but within 5 years, we're going to see a significant change and it's going to get better. So some people think I'm altruistic, but I believe it's going to get better. And it's funny because just today I stumbled on a report from Gallup that backs my theory up completely.
Well, I would love to see that report. Now, is that something that's available over the internet, or?
Yes, in fact, I'm looking at it right here. I'll send you the link.
Well, what we'll do is we'll put that link in the show notes as well. So we'll make that accessible. So given these predictions, we have had a couple guests on that have spoke to the future of society, leadership, coaching, actually outside the podcast as well, some of the coaching groups that I'm affiliated with, the rise of artificial intelligence and the use of it to do jobs or assume the roles that humans are playing today, or that the work we do today is going to be vastly different in 5-10 years as the rise of artificial intelligence continues to evolve. How do you see that impacting your predictions? Is this something maybe it's been on your radar? Is it not yet on your radar? Is it being talked about?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it directly, but I think I can quickly sort of knit this together. I mean, I think prediction one, change is going to happen faster. Well, absolutely. And AI is going to drive a lot of that. 50 years ago, we talked about automating manufacturing processes. My son happens to be a manufacturing engineer, right? And he builds machines that builds machines today. Well, 50 years ago, people did that. And so I think AI is going to make my first prediction happen even faster, right? Around change happening more rapidly. In terms of closing that strategy to execution gap, that's probably a little bit more of a stretch. But I think we kind of have to see where the automation of knowledge work goes. I don't think you're ever going to replace even low-level executives with AI, right? But you can provide more information faster to help them make decisions on a more timely basis, which I think in turn can close that gap. And then as it relates to the third prediction around the integrity deficit syndrome, again, probably a stretch, but I mean, we're kind of seeing it already. And I don't know if it's a direct result of AI, but certainly as a result of more and more ubiquitous technology and social media, it's harder and harder. I'll say this in a negative way. It's harder and harder to get away with bad stuff, right?
Oh, right. Really? Yes.
I was on the bus today in Chicago, and there's little cameras all over the place. You can't do anything wrong. You're going to get caught. So I think AI will, on the positive side, will again provide more data faster to help us keep ourselves honest.
Fantastic. In the time we have left, I want to kind of shift gears just slightly.
Sure.
Given your work, your experience, you and I reconnected in person at a focus group, and you were gracious enough to introduce us to an author, Richard Allred, who was on our podcast just recently, and he wrote the book, Purify: What Clean Water Teaches Us About Making Smarter Decisions. And I'm curious, given your background and all the things you've seen and done, is there a book in you at some point?
Well, thanks for that segue. Yes. Well, in fact, the focus group that you referred to was at Elmhurst College, and I am sponsoring some original research there with their master's program. It's the Industrial and Organizational Psych program, to do some original research around leadership behaviors to drive more effective, healthier cross-functional collaboration. There really isn't a whole lot out there. I have researched it. There's a few scholarly articles, but there's nothing really practical that a leader can pick up and say, I want my organization to be more collaborative. How do I do that? That's in the works.
Excellent. I had a guest on not too long ago, Gordy Curfey, who is an organizational change expert, and his focus is to move away from this professional development focus on the individual to that of the team. Because as a leader, it's one thing to know here's what motivates me, here's my personality, here's my emotional intelligence score, what's the EQ, there's the Gallup survey, those strengths finders.
Oh, strengths finder, yes.
Yeah, and his focus was we have to move more towards the leader in his or her interaction with the team, because it's the team that allows the organization. You've kind of alluded to it. It's that team is the one that has to execute. And if they can't work amongst themselves with each other, down into the organization, up through the organization and across interdependently. That's where the important work should be. And I'm wondering, how are we helping organizations focus more on the team element? I mean, what does it take? Is it just having programs around? Patrick Lencioni is one of my, I wanted to say mentor. I mean, I actually have met him. I asked him a question when he gave a keynote address on millennials. So I figure we're like family. But being team players, being effective within the team is so important. And how do you see the role of being that team player in resulting in the success you see happening inside organizations as they continue to evolve and innovate?
Okay, well, so do you want to extend this podcast to 90 minutes?
Sure, we can do that. What the heck?
That's a big question. And it's a big question.
Okay.
And there's a lot to it. But I think if I were to boil it down, you mentioned Patrick Lencioni. I'm a big fan. I've read probably almost every one of his books. I just picked up one recently that I hadn't read yet.
Which one was that? Naked?
No, it's Silos. This
Oh, yes.
book about silos. I'm sorry, I don't know the title.
That's okay.
But if I boil it down to your question, as simple as possible, I'd say read a couple of his books. One, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I actually use a lot of that material when I'm talking with clients. Use that and turn those 5 dysfunctions into 5 healthy behaviors. That's number one. And that's more about the team. And I think the other one is the team is made up of individuals. So you got to make sure you have the right people, as Jim Collins would say, the right people on the bus. And that would be another one of Lencioni's book called The Ideal Team Player, where he talks about 3 characteristics that you want to make sure you have: hungry, humble, and smart. Read the book. I won't go into the detail here, but the point he makes is that, yes, you need technical skills. If you're hiring an accountant, you need to know that they can do accounting work, right? But what you really need to hire for is hunger, humility, and smartness. That's what you really need to hire for. So I think if you took those 2 things, it really goes a long way to answering your question.
Okay. And we'll certainly provide links back in the podcast notes to Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions, as well as the Ideal Team Player book. In the time we have left, and I know we've gone over my promised 30 minutes, but hey, if you're not in a hurry, I really want to hear about the wine, the family winery, vineyard purchase in the 60s. And when I travel back to Detroit, which is my hometown, the suburbs, some of those wineries are, the big billboards are down I-94. And so tell us a little bit about the wineries and how has that informed you, either running the winery with the family or working in the winery growing up? How has that informed who you are today?
So 2 things stand out. So just maybe a little historical context. My parents bought their first farm in Michigan in 1966. They bought a second farm in 1969. I still own the second farm. So it's been in the family north of 50 years. My dad was the first person, as far as I can determine, nobody's challenged me on this, but my dad was the first person to plant French vinifera, which are like Chardonnay, in Southwest Michigan. So I had an early introduction to this. I wasn't even a teenager yet. But I think, to get your point about what did I learn from it. So from the family farm, I learned about hard work. I mean, we had 60 acres, 60. We had grapes and cherries and peaches and asparagus and black raspberries. And it was a fruit farm. Apples. It was a lot of work. So I learned about hard work. And then somewhere in there, I acquired 60 beehives and we did all the honey and all that. So it was I worked hard. While I was still in high school, my very first job was at Tabor Hill Winery, which still exists and is famous in its own right. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. They were the first winery to make wine out of French grapes. in Southwest Michigan. The man I worked for, Len Olson, he had this vision, this purpose. He wanted to put Michigan on the map, right? It wasn't just this place where you buy grape juice wine, like the old Mogan David 2020 or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Right? No offense to Mogan David 2020. But he really had this passion to put Michigan on the map. And he lived it and he breathed it. And he was pretty successful with it. And from that, I learned about, number one, it's really important to have clear purpose. And number two, persevere. Persevere. And when you're done, persevere some more. Right? He went through a lot of challenges, but he made it work.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm most certain that my listeners will appreciate that. And I know for myself, the next time I go back to Michigan and do the drive, I'm going to have to stop and try some of that fine wine, because literally I've never been there. I see it, but I just drive right past it.
I can give you plenty of recommendations.
Fantastic. I will take you up on that, Steve. Listen, in the time we have left, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, probably two places. One, of course, would be my website, stevesalisburyconsulting.com. There's a lot of different information there about projects that I've done, speaking engagements. There's also a blog out there that where my weekly newsletter gets posted. Lots of good stuff there. And then LinkedIn. Everything that's on my blog also ends up on LinkedIn, but that's a good place to learn about me as well.
Fantastic. And we will most certainly provide links back to the website, LinkedIn, and I know you've got presence on Facebook and Twitter, so we'll provide the links back to that as well. Steve, it has been a pleasure to catch up with you again, go a lot more in depth versus the conversations we've had in the past. I really appreciated, learning more about you, your background, the work you're doing, and a little bit more about the wine. And and we're also very excited about your embarking on becoming an author of, and no doubt will be a very powerful and informative book. And so thank you again for taking time out of your day to be on the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Fantastic. Well, there you have it, folks. We have just been chatting with Steve Salisbury, president of Steve Salisbury Consulting. Steve has been in the organization change, organization management, development, coaching, consulting, working with large organizations on transformative change. And we've talked a little bit about predictions, tools, philosophies, and lessons learned, and really information-rich podcast today. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And once again, we will provide links back to Steve's website, LinkedIn, and his other social platforms as well. And as we say every episode, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there and have a phenomenal day. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.